Apple's China Trap. How the world's biggest company supercharged a rival superpower Apple wasn't always a $3 trillion behemoth. Once upon a time, it was bleeding cash, running out of time, and facing extinction. But desperation sparked bold decisions, ones that took Apple far beyond California's tech utopia and into a high-stakes partnership that would quietly reshape the global order. By 2015, Apple was investing around $55 billion a year into China. Over the past decade, that's added up to more than $500 billion, more than the U.S. spent rebuilding Europe after World War II. And today, Apple can't walk away from China, even if it wants to. What began as a cost-cutting strategy has turned into a deep dependency, one with geopolitical implications far beyond tech. This is not just a business story. It's about how America's most valuable company helped fuel the rise of a strategic competitor, one that now challenges the U.S. in trade, technology, and influence. Let's break down the story few are willing to tell. Designed in California, but built in China, Apple is often celebrated as the crown jewel of American innovation. Sleek design, premium quality, and unmatched global appeal. But peel back the polished branding, and you'll see a reality Apple rarely advertises. Nearly every iPhone, iPad, and MacBook is manufactured not in the U.S., but in China. Over 90% of all iPhones are assembled on Chinese soil. That's no accident. It's the result of decades of deepening integration between Apple and China's state-backed industrial machine. By 2015, Apple was pumping $55 billion annually into China's economy on factories, logistics, workforce training, and supplier ecosystems. That's over 10 times the size of America's CHIPS Act, which aimed to restore U.S. semiconductor manufacturing. It also dwarfs initiatives like Trump's Golden Dome reshoring plan. Apple didn't just outsource. It embedded itself in China. China, factory floor and billion-dollar market. China isn't just where Apple makes its products, it's also where it sells them. In 2023 alone, Apple earned over $72 billion in revenue from the Chinese market, making it the company's second-largest source of income after the U.S. For a brief moment, iPhone sales in China even overtook those in America. That level of growth didn't happen by accident. It was the result of long-term bets that China would remain stable, open, and profitable. Apple invested in local supply chains, engineering, talent, and political goodwill, all in service of a future where China would be its partner, not its rival. But there's a catch. This isn't just a global supply chain. It's a dependency web so tightly woven that pulling out would mean unraveling Apple's entire hardware operation. Why Apple can't leave Apple's supply chain is a technological masterpiece, precisely tuned, deeply integrated, and incredibly hard to replicate. The company doesn't just buy parts from China. It built an entire industrial ecosystem around Chinese capabilities. Factories, suppliers, engineers, toolmakers, shipping routes, all optimized for efficiency within China. Many of Apple's critical machines are custom-built, highly specialized, and now stuck behind Chinese export controls. Rebuilding that infrastructure elsewhere would take years, if not decades. Retraining workers, relocating equipment, re-engineering processes, it's a logistical Everest. China doesn't just hold Apple's labor force. It holds the very tools that make Apple products possible. How it all began, from collapse to comeback. To understand how this dependency formed, we need to rewind to the 1990s, when Apple was on the brink of collapse. In 1996, Apple lost $740 million. In a single year, over $1.4 billion in today's dollars. Its products were overpriced, its market share was shrinking, and Windows-based PCs were dominating the landscape. The company even hired a bankruptcy lawyer at one point. Unlike its competitors, Apple was still clinging to in-house manufacturing. It operated its own factory in Fremont, California, refusing to outsource. That stubbornness became a heavy burden, but desperation breeds innovation. Apple began experimenting first with a plant in Ireland, then Singapore, and later small scale, outsourcing to American firms. It wasn't until after its near-death experience that Apple fully embraced a global production strategy. And when it looked east, it found something extraordinary. Enter Foxconn, the giant behind the iPhone in the early 2000s. Apple needed a manufacturing partner that could move fast, scale quickly, and deliver the level of quality the brand demanded. That's when it found Foxconn, a Taiwanese company led by the relentless Terry Gou. Foxconn didn't just offer cheap labor. It offered scale. Gou built a vast industrial complex in Shenzhen, Foxconn City, capable of housing over 350,000 workers. At its peak, this one facility alone assembled most of the world's iPhones. Within a few years, Foxconn became Apple's primary partner, and China became Apple's de facto factory floor. But this partnership was never just about business. The Chinese government offered Foxconn massive incentives, tax breaks, land deals, infrastructure, and state-backed loans. It was part of a national strategy. China saw Apple not just as a customer, but as a lever for industrial development. Terry Gou responded by setting up over 30 factories across mainland China, building a dense, unbeatable production network. When the iPhone launched in 2007, Foxconn went all in and won big. The silent transformation behind the gleaming screens and App Store glamour. Something deeper was happening. China wasn't just making gadgets. It was absorbing knowledge. As Apple scaled up production, it trained millions of workers, engineers, machinists, factory leads. This became one of China's most powerful assets. The skills Apple instilled didn't stay within Apple's supply chain. Many of these engineers moved on to domestic Chinese firms, startups, and even defense contractors. China gained more than jobs. It gained technical talent, production expertise, and a template for scaling complex industries. This is the part of the Apple China story that rarely gets told. Human cost and government strategy, but there was also a darker side. In 2010, a wave of suicides at Foxconn's Shenzhen plant shocked the world. Workers, many barely out of high school, were living in cramped dorms, working 12-hour shifts for minimal pay. In response, Foxconn installed suicide nets. Labor abuses followed, underage workers, forced internships, grueling overtime. Apple responded with audits and supplier codes of conduct. But the economic model didn't change. Efficiency came first, local. Chinese officials often turned a blind eye or worse, enabled the conditions. For the CCP, these factories weren't just economic engines. They were part of a long-term strategy. Use foreign companies to build domestic capacity. Apple got speed. China got leverage. Beijing tightens the grip. In 2013, the power dynamic shifted. Just one day after Xi Jinping formally assumed power, Chinese state media launched a coordinated attack on Apple, accusing it of unfair warranty practices. The claims were largely exaggerated, but Apple got the message. Tim Cook issued a public apology and made changes to customer service more generous than what Apple offered in the U.S. internally. Apple formed a secretive team called the Gang of Eight to manage government relations. Their conclusion was simple. The only way to survive in China was to support the party's priorities. Apple ramped up investments in local training, engineering education, and supply chain development. Over 25 years, Apple has helped train an estimated 28 million people in China, many of whom now fuel China's broader industrial rise. Unintended consequences. China's Made in China 2025 strategy seeks to dominate robotics, aerospace, semiconductors, and defense technologies. And Apple's manufacturing legacy fits neatly into that ambition. The precision tools used to make iPhones can just as easily be used to build drones, sensors, or even missile components. Advanced manufacturing doesn't care what it produces. It's a question of intent. Apple didn't mean to empower China's defense industry, but the skills, infrastructure, and scale it helped build have made that possible. Compromises and censorship as. Apple deepened its relationship with Beijing. It began making compromises that shook its image. In 2017, it removed all major VPN apps from its Chinese App Store, cutting off access to uncensored internet. That same year, it took down the New York Times app, along with multiple religious and podcast platforms. Apple also agreed to store Chinese user data on servers owned by a state-run company. While Apple claims this data is encrypted, it remains subject to Chinese law and potentially government access. During anti-lockdown protests in 2022, Apple limited AirDrop functionality in China, just as protesters were using it to share uncensored messages. For Apple, staying in China meant following China's rules, even when those rules contradicted the company's values. The great decoupling? Not so fast. Apple is trying to diversify. It's ramping up production in India and Vietnam. In 2023, India exported $12 billion worth of iPhones, and Apple now aims to make 25% of iPhones in India by 2026. But final assembly is just one layer of a vast machine. The real backbone, custom tools, critical parts, trained talent, is still locked inside China. Beijing knows this. It started quietly blocking shipments of Apple's machinery and slowing down permit approvals. It's tightening the very system Apple helped build to keep Apple tethered, America's mirage of reinvestment. Real question: Apple helped build the modern digital world. But in doing so, it also helped build up the very country now competing with the U.S. for global leadership. Apple is caught between profit and power, between American ideals and Chinese realities.